Welcome to TMRN Time Monk Radio Network. I'm Gemini, and today is Saturday, January 14th, 2012. We are joined by Thomas Sheridan, an internationally renowned artist, author, musician, public speaker, and independent researcher currently based in the west of Ireland. His illustrations have appeared on the cover of newsstand magazines, books, and websites worldwide. He is best known for being the author of the book Puzzling People, The Labyrinth of the Psychopath. This book was well received, becoming an underground success and helping Thomas's work reach a much larger audience. Good evening, Thomas. We are so glad to have you join us this evening.
Oh, thank you for having me, and thank you for your introduction. Glad to be here.
Thank you. This interview will delve into Thomas's research of the psychopath, their effects on society, and how they shaped history. You can learn more about Thomas's research, enjoy music by his band The Sulphur Factory, and purchase his artwork at www.thomassheridanarts.blogspot.com. Several members of the forum were kind enough to join us tonight. Please welcome members Bluebell, Green Meadow, Herm, Odinson, and Uranus Rising. Like all of our interviews, this one will be available on YouTube for free and at the Time Monk Radio channel and at the website timemonkradio.com. You may also find links to our interviews at our Time Monk Radio Facebook page. The Time Monk Radio Network administrator and executive producer is Fox, and today he will be doing the recording and technical support of the show. We feel it is imperative that the collective dialogue explores psychopathy and that the populace become aware of psychopaths. The question arises, how are they going to respond? In anticipation of this awakening, it is important that people have as much information to help with identifying said behaviors as well as not getting caught in the quote-unquote dynamic. Thus, hopefully, TMRN can help to head off witch hunts, revenge, etc., which ultimately is not helpful as that perpetuates the dynamic of abuser, victim, martyr, savior, hero. We need to step out of that game. Listeners of this interview should not take any information given as legal, medical, and or professional advice. Such advice can only be properly given by qualified professionals who are fully aware of a person's particular circumstance. Are you ready to get started, Thomas?
I am, yes.
All right, we're going to go into the topic of defining psychopathy. And the first question I have is, you've characterized 5 traits that all psychopaths share. Would you please tell us about them?
The 5 what I felt that there had to be a way to simply help identify the pathology in individuals where people may believe it exists. But I also wanted to create, if you look at the standard diagnostic tools, they could apply to an awful lot of people, and they give you a sort of a sliding scale of how many they tick off. That's basically how it works, and it's a pretty good format. But I started compiling this information about 1994 is when I started. And that was when I got the first book on it, and that's when I first actually met an individual who told me that he was a diagnosed psychopath. And from that point on, I started to just basically take, as part of my regular notebooks and journals, I'm a very big, journal and diarist in my own life. And it just built up this information over the years. And then when I started to ask people about it and encounter people who've been involved in this, I started developing a series of questionnaires, and it became apparent to me that there was a lot of traits out there that could identify someone as being a psychopath, and it was very confusing, and it was also very dangerous. Dangerous for the simple reason that it seemed to me it made it too easy for someone who had a cluster of these traits, for another person who didn't like them, to declare them a psychopath. So I created a spreadsheet about 2 years ago. I started filling it in properly. It was an Access database, and I started filling in the traits. And I only selected ones that scored over 80% over all the case studies I'd done and all the interviews I'd done, and included them as secondary relative traits. There was 5 traits that scored 100% on the actual questionnaires, and I decided to actually include them as absolute traits. That all psychopaths most likely, will have them. I've yet to find someone who doesn't, an actual real psychopath that doesn't have these 5 traits. They must have all 5 traits. This ensures that there's no misidentification, and because you can't have 4 of them and say this person is a psychopath. You have to have all 5. The first one was no remorse, which is obvious. We all know the psychopaths are remorseless. They have no compassion, and they have no conscience. The second one was invented personas. That's creating bespoke personas to manipulate different people and different situations, because no psychopath has a personality as such. They create a mask of sanity to exist in the world. The third one is invoking pity in others to manipulate and control, because psychopaths are an enabler-dependent individual. They have to find empathic people, so they deliberately will use sob stories upon encountering them in order to find these kind of people. Now, many psychopaths will actually be so good by the time they reach middle age that they can actually spot these empathic people that are easy targets when they're walking down the street, but they will still use the pity to manipulate them. The next one is mysterious past or personal histories. All psychopaths have strange past histories. Obviously, if they're not children, I'm talking about adults now here, so anyone from say 30 on will have periods in their life that are missing, that they disappeared for a while, and also their life backstory often doesn't make sense. They will have conflicting and contradictory life stories. And the final one is high levels of the hormone testosterone. All males and all female psychopaths have high levels of testosterone. It shows up in different ways, but there's, the obvious medical ways of looking at how high testosterone is in a man, such as like early balding, upper body strength, or in a woman like a pronounced Adam's apple, or anything like that. If I were to say anyone who has high testosterone is a psychopath, that's, please, nobody should fall into that trap. Lots of women who have high testosterone could have something like polycystic ovary syndrome, where there's actually testosterone being produced by the cyst on the ovaries. And many men who have high testosterone may seem on the surface to be almost psychopathic because they have the impulsiveness and so on, and they tend to be sexual promiscuous, but they have to have those 5 traits. And I've yet to find a psychopath that doesn't have them, and I've yet to be challenged by any professional to say it's not real. So to me, it's as good as anything out there.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I have a follow-up question from Odinson. In your opinion, do you think there's been a rise in the number of psychopaths as of late, or have they always been amongst us, but we're just becoming more aware? And why do you think the conversation about this topic has increased?
Yeah, it's very interesting, all right, how it seems there's been an explosion in the last year or two about this. Are they increasing in numbers? Well, I'd say there's always been the same percentage, more or less. You can't really go back in time and do DNA analysis and find out if there was that many in the past. So we can only really work with the contemporary period, so we're talking about sort of like the late Victorian period on, and it seems to have been the constant seems to have been around 1 to 5%. Now, the thing is, we now have a society where it's easier to be a psychopath. It's much more easier to travel these days. Psychopaths seem to be relatively rare within indigenous societies, for the reason being that they can get caught much more easily, and there's less opportunity for them to do things. So they're sort of, and the overall health of the tribe is much more important than one individual. And a psychopath who is disrupting the security of the tribe would stand out a mile. Now, in modern Western society, you have people can move very easily. They can travel all over the world. It's still relatively easy to change your identity, begin again, get divorced again. So a psychopath can actually do a lot more damage today simply because they have a lot more freedom to do it. Now, one of the reasons people think there's more of them in society today is because you have this sort of proto-psychopathology where people are encouraged through mass media, whether it be pop music or, TV vampire shows or porn or easy access to pornography and things like that they will emulate an almost psychopathic mindset, but they're not true psychopaths. They're just basically a deeply narcissistic individual who's very easily led by media. And that's probably what makes it seem like there's more apparent today. It's just that we live in a very, very selfish and self-absorbed society right now. A lot of this sort of things that the moral and the social buffers have been taken away, and people are just basically free to do whatever they want. And very often they're encouraged also to think and live this way by mainstream media. Now, so there's probably the same amount of psychopaths there always was. Why has this issue come to light so in recent times? I think a lot of it has to do with this waking up community. I think a lot of people know there's instinctually something wrong with the world, and they're looking for a viable answer, a viable, solution to this. and this is probably it. We have to, we have people talking about reptilians and all this other garbage, and that doesn't make any sense to a lot of people now. But what will make sense to the psychopath, and suddenly a lot of boxes are being ticked, and I think that's why it's happening.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And next up, we have Uranus rising.
Hello, Thomas. When doctors or therapists go through their training, quite often they begin to see symptoms of whatever they are studying in themselves or the people around them, which may not be valid observations. As we learn about psychopathic behavior, is there a danger that we might begin to see others as displaying psychopathic symptoms, possibly as a reaction to certain suffering we've endured by those individuals as psychopathic behavior? What thoughts could you offer to us through our discernment process?
Now, you're saying that if somebody has been impacted upon in an abusive way by a psychopath, they will actually begin to emulate the pathology. Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is a lot of times as we're learning about something, I've noticed this with doctors in training, you begin to be aware of the field, so to speak. So you begin to see things in everybody, in yourself and everybody. And, say someone has had a hard time with their partner or someone at work, and they begin to see everybody as psychopaths. Well, how do we discern what is really truly psychopathic behavior? As you just said, we're almost encouraged by our society and mainstream media to mimic psychopathy. So I wonder, what sort of tips you can give us as far as, heading off on it. I mean, it's very important to be aware, and I'm 100% behind your work, but I just want to make sure that we're observing what's really there.
Well, this is a huge issue and a major potential problem that has to be nipped in the bud right off the bat, because a lot of people who have failed in their own lives, who have had a relationship that didn't work out, and maybe they were genuinely abused, it becomes too easy for them to actually say, he was a psychopath, she was a psychopath, as almost a sort of a safety valve in order not to confront their own shadow. And you do get that a lot on some groups. Now, the group that I have, psychopathfree.com, as soon as I see that, or as soon as the moderators see that on a board, you do get people who will stop the trends as maybe you don't know, maybe he wasn't or she wasn't a psychopath. What happens is it becomes a very convenient deflection, sort of like the denial kind of thing, to pass one's own failings upon another human being who may or might not be a psychopath. Yeah, it's not a sadistic or a pathological form of projection like a psychopath does. It's an unfortunate and sad thing in many ways. Now, in the early days when I see it all the time, it's almost like a metamorphosis